Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. I truly hope all of you had a great Thanksgiving and are enjoying your holiday weekend. Due to the holiday weekend, my video this week will have a different format, but I will have the same great information, just in a more condensed form. In this video, I will identify my top players for the main slate that I will be targeting for my player pool. I will then do a lineup building video and game by game breakdown after this video. There's a lot of work to do, so let's get started. With the quarterback position, I'm focusing on the quarterbacks with the higher implied team totals, the matchups, as well as efficiency. Now, I've developed this chart. It's a lot different than what you're used to with my individual videos. And as I said, I've condensed it so I could get all the positions on this video. The main difference is I don't have the positions or the players that I won't be considering. Usually, like with the quarterback, I have all the quarterbacks on there, and then I show you the ones that I'll be targeting. These are the actual ones that I'm targeting, and I'll give you the reasons why. But the categories, and we'll go through the category for each position. But for quarterbacks, the categories over here, obviously you have the position, the team, the salary, pass attempts per game, how many pass attempts their opponent allows per game, their fantasy points scored per game, how many fantasy points their opponent gives up to that position per game, their opponent's ranking to that position, the implied team total for this matchup, and the projected ownership that I had right before I did this video. So to start off with the quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes, he's 7,400 on here. He's averaging 35.9 pass attempts per game. The Raiders are giving up 34 pass attempts per game. Mahomes is scoring 24.1 fantasy points per game, and Oakland's giving up 23, so they're pretty much giving up what he averages. They have a DVP of 28 versus the quarterback position. This is the highest implied total on the board at 30.8, and he has the highest ownership right now of the quarterbacks that I'm going to be targeting. If I can get up to Mahomes, I will. It's just stacking the other players with him. It really takes its toll on your overall salary when you have him at 7,400 and Tyreek Hill at 8,900, and it's just hard to fit those pieces together. But I will do it in a few matchups. I actually like Mahomes more than Jackson this week, and I'll try to have some shares of him in my lineups tomorrow. Next up is Lamar Jackson. He's 7,000. Now these numbers, they're kind of, if you look at it, you'd think, oh, no way am I going to take him. He's red all the way, pretty much all the way across. And I did want to mention that to you guys too. The red is obviously the worst. Yellow is middle of the road, and green is the best. But it's for that in comparison for that category. Obviously, Mahomes up here in red for 7,400 doesn't mean he's a bad quarterback. Just in comparison to the 4,700, that's the salary's higher, making that the worst salary there in that category. But if you go over here to fantasy points per game, he's actually the second highest out of the quarterbacks that I'm going to be targeting. So we have Lamar Jackson, and like I said, he's almost red all the way across. The one thing that I don't have in here, and we all know about Lamar Jackson, is the rushing ability that he brings with the quarterback position. And it's like having two players for the price of one. He is actually the number 9 running back for the season so far through the first 12 weeks. So you factor that in with a little bit of passing that he does give you, and it gives you two players, just like Christian McCaffrey gives you a running back and a wide receiver, and that's why they're priced up. I will say this about the Baltimore game. I did see the weather report. You might want to look at that. It's supposed to have significant rainfall, a little bit of wind, which will play into more of a running game. Now, he definitely has a tougher matchup this week. And you look right here, San Francisco has a DVP of 2 versus the quarterback position, but they haven't played Lamar Jackson. And I'm sure most of you are aware, you've seen the Monday night game, what they just did this past week, but he's been doing it all year. He's averaging 11 rushes and over 80 yards per game just rushing. And phenomenal player. He's averaging 29.5 fantasy points per game, which is the most out of the quarterbacks that I'm going to be targeting, more than Mahomes. I like Mahomes more this week just because of the matchup. They do have a fairly high implied total, 25.8, even going against San Francisco, and second highest ownership for Jackson. It's just, and he's a quarterback. I usually like to have a target to go with my quarterback. He's one of the quarterbacks that you can run out there and you don't have to have a target. I mean, Mark Andrews he likes to go to his tight ends a lot. Andrews, Hurst, and Boyle, but I'll have some shares of him. But if I can get up to that, I'm probably going to try to get on up to Mahomes too. Next is Aaron Rodgers. I really like Aaron Rodgers this week. The matchup is really good. He's 6,500, so 900 less than Mahomes. He's averaging 34.5 attempts per game. The Giants are giving up 32.2 attempts per game. He's only averaging 19.2 fantasy points per game. Giants are giving up 22. They have a DVP of 24 versus the quarterback position. Implied total, third highest on this main slate. Same implied total as Baltimore. And his ownership is lower, which makes him appealing as well. I really like Rodgers in this matchup in New York. I did see that there's going to be rain in this game as well, so keep an eye on that. As long as it's not pouring down rain like they had in the Patriots-Cowboys game last week or a few weeks ago with the San Fran-Washington game, something that will affect the passing game because, with Rodgers, obviously you want him to be throwing the ball around. So I will have. I'll probably be slightly above the field on Rodgers, but I really like him at that price this week. Next is Jared Goff. He's 6,000. He's averaging 37.3 pass attempts per game, second highest out of the ones that I like. The Arizona's given up 38 pass attempts per game, and he's only scoring 15.4 fantasy points per game. But Arizona gives up 27.8 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position with a DVP of 32, worst in the NFL versus the quarterback. Implied total is only 25.3, so kind of middle of the road. And ownership is not that high either, at 7.76. I really like Goff. I think recency bias is going to cause his ownership to go down. Everybody's seen what happened on Monday night, and I like to play players in the bounce back, especially when they've had a lot of they've been seen on national TV or something and they just flop. I like a lot of times to come back to those type players. I will have Jared Goff's one of my favorite quarterbacks this week. To move the ball against Arizona, it's easier to do it through the air. And I think this is a really good matchup for him. Great matchup for all the wide receivers, and you can stack it a lot of different ways. The problem I'm having is if I want to do a game stack, which piece of Arizona do I want to bring back? But I really like Jared Goff this week. Next up is Carson Wentz. He's 5,800. He's averaging 35.3 pass attempts per game. 31.7 is what Miami's given up. He's only averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game. Miami's given up 23 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. They have a DVP of 30 versus the quarterback. And second highest implied total of 27.5 points. Really low ownership at 1.65. It's been the thing to do this year is to play your skill players against Miami. No different here. No weather concerns. 79 degrees. Really good matchup for Philadelphia. It's just no matter how much they will have to do. I don't. The Eagles' defense doesn't scare me enough um, that I would think that Miami won't be able to put some points on the board, and that's what you want. You want the other team to be able to score so they don't have to pull back the reins or go to the running game and seal the game. Large favorite on the road. So I really like Carson Wentz this week in this matchup against Miami, and I'll have a significant amount of shares of him as well. Nick Foles, Jacksonville is $100 cheaper than Carson Wentz. He's at home. He's averaging 34.3 pass attempts per game. The Tampa Bay's given up 41.7 pass attempts per game. He's only scoring 13.6 fantasy points per game, but Tampa Bay is giving up 25 fantasy points per game, which is a number 31 versus the quarterback position. Fairly low implied total, 22.5, and the ownership isn't that high either. And this is actually the second highest total on the board at 48.5 points. Slight home favorite or a home underdog, I'm sorry, and I really like him at that price at 5,700 and stacking. You can stack this game all kinds of ways with Foles and Westbrook and Chark, and bring it back with some of the Tampa Bay passing pieces, Godwin and Evans. But I really like Foles this week. Next up was Kyle Allen for Carolina. He's 5,500, 35.6 pass attempts per game. Washington's giving up 31.5 pass attempts per game. He's only averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game. Washington's giving up 19. The thing with Kyle Allen and other pieces of the Carolina offense is the offense runs through Christian McCaffrey. He's over 50% of their offense. So getting the other pieces right is sometimes difficult with DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel and Greg Olsen and some other mouths that need to be fed. But a really nice price of 5,500 playing at home. I just don't know. This is a scenario where I was just talking about some other quarterbacks. I don't know if Washington's going to be able to score enough to make Allen be viable. It doesn't take much to pay off the 5,500, but with Christian McCaffrey, I don't know that there will be enough meat left on the bone for Kyle Allen to be that great. But I will have some shares of him. I like it. He's at home, and I like that price. Last is Andy Dalton. Please don't turn off your video right now. Dalton's 4,700. He's averaging 42.3 pass attempts per game, the most on the main slate, or out of the ones that I'm targeting. And the Jets are giving up 37.3 pass attempts per game. The way to move the ball on the Jets is through the air. They're pretty stingy. They have the number one DVOA versus the run. So the run game is probably not going to work that well for Cincinnati tomorrow. Dalton's coming back after they had their 3-game experiment with Ryan Finley. And this sets up real nice. The narrative is coming back, showing that he should have never been replaced. He was bitter when he got replaced by the rookie Finley, and now he's back. I really like him teamed up with Tyler Boyd at 4,700. Dalton allows you to do a lot of things with your lineup and in other places. So fairly low ownership, 2.25, but I have heard a lot of talk about him, and it'll probably go up a little bit. But I really like Andy Dalton at that price, and I think the Jets will be able to score. So the back and forth, and he's averaging 42 pass attempts per game anyway, and I really think this is setting up real nice for him, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was in the top 5 in the quarterbacks tomorrow. I thought they had a good chance at beating Pittsburgh last week. It didn't happen. Obviously, I don't think they'll go winless. I do feel that teams that haven't won a game are very dangerous. Every game becomes a Super Bowl. They don't want to be. Cincinnati's already set the record for the worst start in franchise history, and they want to get that off their back. So this is a very dangerous team, and I wouldn't be surprised if they beat the Jets. Jets are coming off blowing out Oakland last week. Everybody's seen that. recency bias. Now they're going on. They were at home. Now they're going. They were a home underdog. Now they're going on the road as an away favorite. So there's a lot to that, and I'll have a lot of shares of Andy Dalton tomorrow. Okay, so that sums up the quarterbacks that I'm going to be. These are all the quarterbacks I'll be targeting in my lineups tomorrow. Next is the running backs, and I've broken that down obviously by salary, their touches per game, fantasy points scored per game, how many their opponent gives up to that position per game, what their ranking is, and their projected ownership. Number one, Christian McCaffrey, 10,500. I don't know how you keep this guy out of your lineup. All he does is average pretty much, even since they've raised him up to 10,500, he's still getting the exact value that you would want. He has over 50% share of the offense. He's averaging 26.3 touches per game. That's carries and receptions. The most in the NFL right now. He's averaging 27.5 fantasy points per game. Washington's given up 26.6 to the running back position and that DVP of 22. He's got the second highest ownership out of the running backs that I like. But I will definitely begin building my lineups around him. And with some of the lower owned and lower salary quarterbacks, it's more possible to have him in there. I learned my lesson a few weeks ago. About mid-season, I faded him. I believe it was against Jacksonville, and I thought it was not a good matchup for him, and it was a 51-point day. I think it was his highest of the season. So since then, I've been above the field on most games as far as having him in my lineups. By above the field is mean when you see a projected ownership at like 20.13, that means that I might have had him in 25 to 30% of my lineups. Now I don't MME, meaning I don't play 150 lineups. If I could, I would. It just makes sense. I've actually had the lineup in my with the optimizers that I use. I've had the winning lineup that would have beat the eventual winner of the Milly Maker for DraftKings. I've done that 3 times this year. So I don't have, I do play a lot of different contests, head to head, 50-50. I play a couple in the Milly Maker, some of the larger GPPs, and I mix it up. So when I talk about have my share and being more above, higher than the field, I might not have 150 lineups, but say I max out $1 entry, 20 entries max in a larger GPP. If it was 20%, which would be four lineups out of that, I would probably have 8 with him in it. And I just don't know how you get away from this guy. Next up is Nick Chubb. He's 1,700. He's averaging 22.9 touches per game, 16.8 fantasy points per game. The thing about Chubb is, ever since the Kareem Hunt has come off his suspension, Chubb's not getting any passes out of the backfield, and he's given up some of his carries. So I don't really like running back committees. I probably won't have very much of Nick Chubb. He's appealing because of his touches per game that he does get, and they like to use him on the goal line no matter what. But going to Pittsburgh, a division game, this is also just 2 weeks ago, they're coming off that real bitter helmet episode. Pittsburgh's been playing decent defense, and I don't know that this is a ceiling type game for Nick Chubb. And with the threat of Kareem Hunt as well, you got to temper your expectations. After Chubb is Leonard Fournette, and I usually have the running backs or have them in my player pool, the guys that are getting all the touches. I mean, Fournette's getting 23.8 touches per game. He's only averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game because he doesn't fall in the end zone that much. I think once or twice this year. Tampa Bay's stingy versus the run. They're number two DVP versus the running back position. His ownership isn't that high. It's manageable at 12.72. It's kind of hard to get to him at that price at 7,500, especially if you're going to have McCaffrey. You can forget it. I mean, you can do it obviously with some ridiculous builds, but I don't try to put a whole lot of $3,000 salary players in my lineup just so I can have three or four of the highest players. But um, they are home. Pay attention to the weather. If this, I believe the weather's there's a chance of rain. The Miami game is the one that's going to have the best weather, but there might be a chance of rain. Always check that anyhow. That type of game would set up for Fournette, or a windy game or something like that would set up better for him. But I think the matchup for Jacksonville tomorrow is actually going to be the pass game because Tampa Bay gives it up through the air, and being stingy, they just funnel the game to your wide receivers. So have some small shares just based on touches alone. If this guy ever starts falling in the end zone, he's going to have some really big ceiling games, but it's just not happening for him. Saquon Barkley, when I first seen this was one of my favorites. Still like it quite a bit because you're not going to see Barkley at 7,400 much. He's getting 19.2 touches per game. He's only averaging 13.4 fantasy points per game. He hasn't had that really big ceiling game. Um, Green Bay's given up 29.5 fantasy points per game to the running back position. A number 30 DVP versus the running back. Ownership is it's medium. I mean, he's definitely under McCaffrey. He's a nice pivot off of McCaffrey. I look for his ownership to go up. I really like Barkley as part of a game stack with Rodgers and Adams, and coming back with Barkley. It's expensive, but I really like that, and I will have some shares of Barkley tomorrow. Very appealing and one of my favorites this week with McCaffrey. Le'Veon Bell, 7,200. He's getting 20.3 touches per game. He's only scoring 12.9 fantasy points per game. He's another one that's not getting touchdowns. Cincinnati gives up 28.5 fantasy points per game to the running back position. They have a 27 DVP. His ownership is it's mid range, 8.55% ownership. The thing with Bell is he's only got over 20 fantasy points a couple times, and you need 22 or 23 to get value. He does get a lot of touches. It sets up real nice against Cincinnati. He's game script. He's not game script dependent. They'll have him out there on the field just like McCaffrey. It's just, can he get there? Can he get the ceiling game? Can it be against Cincinnati? And I like him at that price. Him and Barkley. I like I like a lot of the running backs that get the most touches. Running backs, I'm looking for volume. I try to play three running backs in my lineup by using one in the flex position, and I'm shooting for 65 to 70 touches between the three of them. That gets me where I want to be for my scoring. If they're averaging 1.33 or better fantasy points per touch, that would be 14.5 fantasy points per game. Oakland or Kansas City first 32 DVP versus the running back. They're giving up 33.2 fantasy points per game to the running back. Really high ownership, higher than McCaffrey projected from the site that I use. I like Josh Jacobs, but if Kansas City jumps out to, let's say, 21-0 game, Josh Jacobs becomes irrelevant, and they like to go to Jalen Richard and throw him passes out of the backfield in comeback mode. And that's really scary because this game is projected to kind of go like that. Kansas City's a 10-point home favorite, I believe. Yeah, 10-point home favorite with a 51-point over-under. I believe that's actually went down to 50. But I won't have as many shares as Jacobs as I normally do. I just don't like the the um, the fact that this is the type of game that he could get phased out. Next is Aaron Jones, Green Bay. He's 6,800. He's getting 16.7 touches per game, averaging 18 fantasy points per game. Giants are giving up 24.6 fantasy points per game to the running back, which is a 17 DVP. He's number 14. I don't like this that much. Pretty much based on the fact that the last few games he's been getting like 13 touches per game. There's been games though where he got 13 touches and some receptions and got 3 touchdowns, but you always get regression on things like that. And then you have Jamal Williams back there, which that takes away from him. I've seen games where he's running the ball between the 20 and get down close to the end zone, and in comes Jamal Williams. Plus, I believe this is going to be a passing game for Aaron Rodgers, so I'm not sure how much shares I'll have of him. I will have some, because he's had some really big games, and he's capable of doing that against the Giants. And it is that game, I know for sure, is supposed to have a lot of rain and some wind. So check it out before game time. That would make him more viable, in my opinion, if it's a game where the passing game's not going to be able to get going. Next up, Miles Sanders for Philadelphia is 5,400. He's only averaging 11.5 touches per game. He's averaging 9.4 fantasy points per game. Miami's number 29 DVP versus the running back. They're giving up 29.1 fantasy points per game. He's got fairly low ownership, and I thought it would be a lot higher than that, 5.37. I think Jordan Howard has officially been ruled out. And as I mentioned earlier, the thing to do this year has been to play your skill players versus Miami. So I have a lot of interest in Sanders, and using him allows you to get up to some other positions. You got to worry a little bit about Jay Ajayi there. They like Ajayi, that's why they brought him back. But I like that price, and it doesn't take much to get value at 5,400. Playing Miami in Miami, no weather concerns, sets up real nice. Next is Williams from Indianapolis, 5,300, averaging 11.3 touches per game, 11.6 fantasy points per game. And Tennessee's giving up 25.9 fantasy points per game to the running back, which is a 21 DVP. He has really high ownership because of his 17.22% ownership because of his price. The game when the Thursday night game against Houston, he was the bell cow for Indianapolis, and I believe he had like 26 carries in that game. And a game like that, if this game is like that and he gets that many carries, 23 carries, 24 carries, couple receptions, he could absolutely smash that price. He's really popular. I'll be lower than the field. I just feel like it's too obvious, and I don't know. I'm just not that crazy about that, and so I'll have some shares, but I'll be lower than the field. Ronald Jones, Tampa Bay, he's 5,100, and he's averaging 12.7 touches per game, 9.8 fantasy points per game. Jacksonville has been not good at all versus the run this year. 25 DVP versus the running back position, giving up 28.1 fantasy points per game. He's got really low ownerships, and he's being overlooked. I really like Ronald Jones this week, and I'll be above the field on him. I think that's a nice way to differentiate yourself, especially in like a larger GPP. If you went with the Jacksonville passing game and brought it back with the Tampa Bay running game, that would be contrarian. So there's a lot of people who are going to be trying to stack up Godwin and Evans somehow with Winston and Foles. I mean, it's the second highest projected total on the board, and so I will have some shares of him in a contrarian move. Next is Philip Lindsay, 5,000. He's averaging 15.9 touches per game, 12.1 fantasy points per game. Same, Tampa Bay, or I'm sorry, Chargers give up the same amount as Jacksonville, 28.1 fantasy points per game, and it's tied at the DVP of 25. His ownership is kind of a little bit higher than I expected it to be, but the 5,000, and in the last few weeks he has been getting most of the touches. So where before him and Freeman were a little bit closer in touches. Now their snap percentage is very close to the same amount, but Lindsey is getting the touches. Brandon Allen back there, and there's Drew Lock has been cleared to play, I believe. I don't think he's starting, but I believe that Denver at home will try to get Lindsey established this week against the Chargers. These two teams have slow pace, so this probably sets up pretty nice for the running backs in this game. Last is Darrell Williams. He's 4,400 for Kansas City. He's only averaging 4.1 touches per game, 6.5 fantasy points per game. Oakland gives up 25.2 fantasy points per game to the running back, which is a 19 DVP. He has 1.08 projected ownership. Damian Williams has been ruled out. LaShawn McCoy as the other running back that you have to deal with. But I think Darrell Williams could be sneaky contrarian, and I'm really interested in him at that price. Maybe in my flex spot, and I could see if they could get a lead on Oakland, resorting to the passing game or the rushing game, and I'll take a couple of shots with Darrell Williams. Okay, bear with me. I'm going to scroll this upward. I'm going to go to the wide receivers. Again, I have them broken down as the team's salary, their targets per game, their fantasy points scored per game, what their opponents allow to the wide receiver position, their opponents' rank versus that position, their air yards per game, their average depth of target, and their projected ownership. Top of the list, Tyreek Hill. If you're going to consider Patrick Mahomes, this is the target that you want to have with him and Kelsey, or if you can get both of them in your lineup. When Tyreek's on the field, he can take it to the house at any time. He's averaged 7.9 targets per game, 17.9 fantasy points per game. Oakland's 24 DVP, they're giving up 39.1 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He's got over 120 yards, air yards per game, and that's total yards from routes ran, whether he received the ball or not. And this is the average depth of his target when he's actually targeted, whether he catches it or not. His ownership isn't the highest; it's 10.32, but that's brought down a lot by his salary. His salary, if people, it looks like people are going to be spending down away from that. That makes him contrarian and even that more interesting. And this guy can definitely break the slate. So when I have Mahomes, I would definitely have Tyreek Hill with him. I'm not sure how much I'll get to him, but I will have some shares of him and probably be above the what the projected ownership is right now. Chris Godwin is next, 7,700. He's averaging 8.8 targets per game, scoring 22.6 fantasy points per game. Jacksonville's number 14 DVP versus the wide receiver. They're only giving up 34.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He's averaging just under 100 yards per game. Air yards 98.2, has an ADOT of 11. His ownership's 10.44. Recency bias is going to cause his ownership to go up, and it has caused it to be up where it is. He was, I believe, the highest scoring fantasy player last week, scoring 40 fantasy points. Thing with the Tampa Bay air raid is you don't know which receiver it's going to be. And another thing to be watching in this game is the weather, so make sure you check that out first. I think there's maybe a little rain, but there was something about 15 to 20 mile an hour winds. So check that out. Um, I might take a couple stabs at Godwin. It's like I said, it's just getting that. Is it going to be Godwin or is it going to be Evans? And and Winston likes to put the ball in. He throws the ball. He puts the ball in the air 40 times a game. So they're definitely viable. It's just a matter of getting them right. After Godwin is Cup. I really like Cup this week because, as I mentioned, Golf is one of my favorite quarterbacks. He's 7,100. He's averaging 9.5 targets per game. He's scoring 18.2 fantasy points per game. And Arizona gives up 40 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is a 27 DVP. He only averages 71 air yards per game. 7.5 is his average depth of target. So he runs pretty short routes and gets targeted a ton by Jared Goff. And his ownership's up there. And actually, with Cooks being healthy now, Cooks and Woods is what makes Cup a lot better. He's had a couple down weeks, and I could see a nice bounce back for Cooper Kupp this week. Devontae Adams, another favorite of mine this week. He's 7,000. He's probably actually my very favorite this week. He's averaging just under 10 targets per game, 9.9. Giants give up 17.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. No, he scores 17.3 fantasy points per game. The Giants give up 43.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver, which is 31 DVP. He's got 106.9 air yards average. Average depth of targets 10.8. Projected ownership, he's up there, double digits, 12%. But he's not the highest on. He's under Cup and Evans and Chark. So I really like Devontae Adams. I'll be above the field with him tomorrow. Really like that a lot. Mike Evans, 6,900. Um, Considerably less than what Godwin is, but Godwin's coming off the big game. And I believe a few weeks ago when Evans had the big game, the following week he was priced up higher than Godwin. He's averaging nine. He's actually averaging more targets per game than Godwin, and he's scoring 19.9 fantasy points per game. And as I mentioned, Jacksonville's 14 DVP versus wide receiver. He's averaging 145.2 air yards per game. That's the most the wide receivers that I have that I'm targeting. He's tied for the highest ADOT with Tyreek Hill at 15.2. His ownership is the most out of the wide receivers that I like at 13.96. And his ownership will probably be higher than Godwin's because of the $800 savings. But it's the same thing. Which one will it be? And if you ever have Winston and Godwin and Evans, and Winston goes off for 400 and two touchdowns and splits it up between these two, you'll probably take down whatever contest you're in. DJ Moore, Carolina, 6,800, averaging 9.4 targets per game. If it's not McCaffrey that Allen's getting the ball to, he's looking for more. Moore scoring 17.1 fantasy points per game. Washington's got a 15 DVP versus the wide receiver, only giving up 35.2 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Averages 97.8 air yards per game, has an ADOT of 10.4, and his ownership is middle. Yes, middle of the road. It's not the highest, 10.16. I'm just afraid of Moore because I know how much McCaffrey is involved and can take over the game, and if there's nothing left on the bone, then $1,600. So I need 20 points out of him. He's been scoring a lot, and Allen goes to him. It's just you do have to factor in how much offense is left to go around after McCaffrey. DJ Chark for Jacksonville, really like this, 6,600. He's averaging 8.2 fantasy points per game, 18.2 fantasy points per game, 8.2 targets per game. Tampa Bay is the worst versus the wide receiver position, giving up 32, or have a DVP of 32. They're giving up 49.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He averages 101.3 fantasy points or air yards per game. Fantasy points, that'd be great. ADOT at 12.2. Pretty high ownership, 11.84. This will probably be a popular stack with Foles. When I was hoping at the beginning of the week it'd probably be contrarian. And DJ Chark, you can also use him as a one-off. You don't necessarily have to have him stacked. He'll probably be a part of that Jacksonville Tampa Bay stack going on tomorrow for a lot of people. Manuel Sanders, 6,300. I'm probably not gonna. I actually liked this at first. Then I read the weather report, and I pretty much changed my mind. He does. He is the guy that Garoppolo likes to go to. They are a 6-point road underdog. If Baltimore's DVP middle of the road, giving up 36.1 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Sanders is averaging 5.6 targets per game and 11.4 fantasy points per game. San Francisco wants to run the ball, but they have been throwing it a lot lately. And I could see him getting. I just don't like how this game's setting up weather-wise, and this could be a really low-scoring game. Battle of two tough defenses, and so I probably actually when I first seen it, I liked it. I probably won't have any shares of him in my lineups. Devontae Parker, 5,700. I like this one a lot too. He's averaging 7.5 targets per game. He's had a few games where he's had just a significant amount of targets, averaging 13 fantasy points per game. Philadelphia, if you're going to move the ball against them, it's going to be in the air. They're 26 DVP, giving up 39.9 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's averaging 99.3 air yards per game, 13.2 per target, ADOT. He's got pretty high ownership. I was a little bit surprised when I seen that. I thought he might go overlooked, but at that price, a lot of people were interested in him as well as myself. Terry McLaurin, 5,600, averaging 6.8 targets per game, 14 fantasy points per game. Carolina, you can move the ball on them through the air. They're 28 DVP, 41.5 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He has a 14.6 average depth of target, and he's going fairly. He's got fairly low ownership, and stacking him up, bringing him back with Allen or McCaffrey and having a piece of the game. It's just Washington's offense is anemic, so for him to pay that all, I just don't know if he can get there. 17 points to get to value. That might be asking a lot out of Haskins, and Carolina's defense has been pretty good at limiting scoring and putting pressure on the quarterback. Robert Woods from Rams, 5,500, averaging 8 targets per game, 13.3 fantasy points per game. Arizona, as I mentioned, with Cooper Kupp, they're 27 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They give up 40 fantasy points, per game to the wide receiver. He's averaging 74.6 air yards per game, has an ADOT of 9.3, and he has a projected ownership of 5.24. I think he's going overlooked. Definitely. I really like that price. I really like golf, and I will have some shares of Robert Woods. He's definitely being overlooked. I like teaming him up with Cooper Kupp, and I would be above the field with him. Tyler Boyd, Cincinnati, 5,500. He's getting 9.3 targets per game. Got Andy Dalton back tomorrow, scoring 14 fantasy points per game. The Jets give up 39.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is a 25 DVP. He averages 66.2 air yards per game, 7.1 ADOT. It's kind of low, and really low, not kind of. And it's kind of going overlooked. I like stacking him up with Andy Dalton, and I will have some shares of him, which allows me to pay up at other positions. Sammy Watkins, Kansas City. Nice pivot off of Tyreek Hill at 5,400, averaging 7.6 targets per game. Really, he's only had those really two good games. So he might go overlooked. His ownership's only 6.6. He's averaging 8.9 ADOT, 66.9 air yards per game. Um, Raiders have a 24 DVP and giving up 39.1 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. I might have some shares of him as a pivot off of Tyreek Hill, so that might be kind of like running Watkins with Kelsey, which doesn't limit my lineup that much. If I try to go Kelsey and Hill and Mahomes, now my lineup is significantly weakened in other areas. Brandon Cooks, 5,200, 5.4 targets per game, 9.6 fantasy points per game. Again, playing Arizona, 27 DVP, 40 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. This is a really good matchup for the Rams passing game. He's got a 14.3 ADOT. He's averaging 77.8 air yards per game. Low ownership. I'll have some shares of Cooks. I'm going to have some shares of Golf and all those receivers. And it's just, I don't know, bringing it back from Arizona is when I'm having trouble trying to figure that stack out. Alshon Jeffrey's back for Philadelphia. As I mentioned earlier, the thing to do this year has been to play your skill players against Miami. He's only 5,100, averaging 6.8 targets per game. I like him even more if Zach Ertz is ruled out. Last I seen, Ertz is questionable. But Jeffrey's averaged 6.8 targets per game, 11.7 fantasy points per game. Miami's giving up 38.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Have a DVP of 22. This is average 62.6 air yards per game, 9.1 ADOT, and fairly low ownership at 5.12. So I'll probably be above the field with Jeffries. D.D. Westbrook, I really like teaming him up with Nick Foles. I like that Jacksonville passing game versus Tampa Bay tomorrow. He's only 5,000. Like teaming him up with DJ Chark. He's getting 7 targets per game, 10.3 fantasy points per game. As I mentioned, Tampa Bay's 32 DVP versus the wide receiver position, giving up 49.7 fantasy points per game. He's averaged 46.3 air yards per game and 6.6 ADOT. Doesn't run that many deep routes, and projected ownership is really low. So he actually might be a nice pivot off of DJ Chark, because Chark's going to have, he's on the players that I like, he's 4th in ownership, so he might be a nice pivot away from that. Sterling Shepard from the Giants, he was one of my late ads, 4,900, averaging 8.8 targets per game, 15.1 fantasy points per game. Green Bay gives up 31.6 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, a number 9 DVP. He averages 85.2 air yards per game. Some reason we're missing his ADOT. But has a projected ownership of 6.8. And I like Shepard a lot tomorrow, and especially if the Packers can do some scoring, which I'm pretty sure they will. And I don't think this will be the pace of this game. I kind of favors higher scoring. The over-under on this game is 45.5. They're a home underdog who checks off a lot of the boxes, and I really like Sterling Shepard tomorrow. Last is Alden Tate, who's 3,800. Another Andy Dalton target. Averaging 6.9 targets per game. Was getting targeted a lot when Dalton was the starting quarterback before. He's out averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game. The Jets, as I mentioned, the way to move the ball on them is through the air. 25 DVP, giving up 39.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's averaged 72.3 air yards per game, 10.5 ADOT, and his ownership's really low at 2.28. So I will have some shares of Alden Tate as well. I really like that price, and I really like Andy Dalton tomorrow. And teaming him up with a few of his targets. Next up is the tight end position, and we have, let's see here, Travis Kelce, 7,200. These are the categories: targets per game, fantasy points per game, how many the opponent gives up per game to the tight end, and the opponent's DVP ranking, the red zone targets, and the projected ownership. Kelce, 8.3 targets per game, scoring 12.6 fantasy points per game. Oakland gives up 11.9 fantasy points per game to the tight end and have a 28 DVP. Red zone targets, he's had 14. His ownership's 7.32, which he doesn't have the highest. Actually, there's three that are higher owned than him. He's probably going to be contrarian because of his salary. It's just a matter of getting up to him, and I really like him tomorrow. I like the matchup. Mahomes at home, large favorite. I really like Kelce tomorrow. It's just a matter of getting up and spending. I like to do that. If people are spending down at positions, I'll spend up to be contrarian, and then vice versa. If they're spending up, if Kelce had higher ownership, I'd be going down. But I'll be trying to figure out a way to get up to include him in a lot of my lineups. He'll definitely be in most of the lineups that I have Mahomes. Next up, Zach Ertz. He's 6,700. He's averaging 9 targets per game, 11.2 fantasy points per game. Miami's middle of the road, giving up 16 DVP versus the tight end position. I guess teams attack him in all the other areas. Only giving up 9.6 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He's had 10 red zone targets. His ownership's up there, 10.98. I really like teaming him up with Wentz. Check and make sure that he's going to be in the game. That's kind of scares me a little bit, an injury. And they do have another viable tight end, which I will get to here in a minute, in Goddard. So I don't know that I'll have a lot of Ertz because of those reasons. Darren Waller for Oakland, prices went down, 5,500, averaging 7.1 targets per game. Kansas City, or he's scoring 10.8 fantasy points per game. Kansas City's 26 DVP versus tight end, giving 11.1 fantasy points per game. He's had 10 red zone targets, has the highest ownership right now of the tight ends that I like. I really like him at that price. I like the game script. I am playing from behind. Could see him getting a lot of targets from Derek Carr. Greg Olsen, 4,400, 6.1 targets per game, averaging 8 fantasy points per game. And Washington, 22 DVP versus the tight end, giving up 10.5 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. He's just 6 red zone targets. He's got fairly high ownership as well. And it's because of his price, 4,400. Nice pivot off the higher owned or the more expensive and higher owned tight ends. It's just another mouth to feed in that Carolina offense that worries me. And because to get all of them involved in a game stack, I need Washington to score, and I don't know that that's going to happen. So that's what scares me about having anything other than Christian McCaffrey. Dallas Goedert, 4,100. I will probably play more Goddard than I will Ertz, with Ertz being banged up. He could be out there as a decoy. Goddard's averaging 4.6 targets per game, 6.4 fantasy points per game. And Miami's have a 16 DVP versus the tight end position, giving up 9.6 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He's had 6 red zone targets. His ownership's lower. I don't know how much. Now, if Miami can do some scoring, then this might really benefit the tight ends. I just don't know how much they'll have to do, and if they can just gain control of the game with the running game. But I will if I have a tight end from Philadelphia, I'll probably have more Goddard than I will Ertz. Janu Smith from Tennessee. Delaney Walker's been ruled out for the year, so the job is his now. He's 3,300. He's averaging 2.6 targets per game, 4.7 fantasy points per game. Indianapolis is number 20 DVP versus the tight end position, and he giving up 10.2 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He's had 4 red zone targets, and his ownership is really low at 3.18. So I have a little bit of interest in him because of the price. but that'll be probably about where the field is on him and on ownership. Jack Doyle, Ebron's out for the season, I believe. He's 3,300. He's averaging 3.8 targets per game, 6.3 fantasy points per game, tied with Tennessee at. I hope I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but he's had 6 red zone targets, and his ownership is low as well, 3.9. I like Doyle more than I like Janu Smith tomorrow, mainly because Marlon Mack's out. I think a lot of people are going to be pushed to Jonathan or to Williams, the running back, because of his price, and the passing game from Indianapolis could go overlooked. Caden Smith from the Giants, I know who, and he's 2,900. He's only averaging 1.8 targets per game, 5.4 fantasy points per game, which is value if you look at that in his first game. Um, no, not really. It's just 2 times, but um, Green Bay's number 30 DVP versus the tight end, and the job is his. Ingram's out, Red Ellison's out, and Green Bay gives up 12.8 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. He's had 2 red zone targets already, so Danny Dimes likes to go to him, and very low ownership at 0.6. I might have some exposure to him, um, almost rock bottom 2,900, and that definitely allows you to do some different things with your lineup. Tyler Higbee, Everett's been ruled out. I'm pretty sure Everett's out. Higbee's 2,500, the minimum, 3.3 targets per game. As I said, I really like the Rams passing game. And Arizona is the worst against the tight end position, number 32. They funnel points to the tight end, and he's averaging 17 point, or they give up 17.4 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He's had 6 red zone targets, less than 1% ownership, 0.38. I will have a lot of shares of Tyler Higbee tomorrow. Okay, lastly, my defenses. I like to, my theme of the week for my defenses is I picked the 4 defenses that were going against rookie quarterbacks, and I generally like the favorites. I like the teams that are the big favorites because they're going to be forcing those teams to, if they're going to be ahead by a lot, the other team's going to have to throw the ball, which throwing the ball creates all kinds of possibilities for defensive points. These teams aren't really that big of favorites. They're favorites, but I really like it because they're all facing a rookie quarterback. I like Carolina's defense as my spend up, 3,800 going against Washington's Dwayne Haskins. I like Green Bay's defense, really low ownership at 1.58, going overlooked playing against Danny Dimes and the Giants. I like the Rams going against Kyle Murray. They got a little bit higher ownership, and I like the Browns as my spin down option. They're only 2,600 on the road. I don't generally play a lot of the road defenses, but my theme this week for my defenses was defenses that are playing against rookie quarterbacks. These are the 4 that I'm going to be targeting to fill out my lineups. If I can spend up, I'll get to Carolina. If not, I'll use Cleveland. And I don't punt any position. Because every position represents 11% of my score. So I did put some thought into this. I also have a little bit of interest in the Kansas City defense too, but I was going to go with this theme. I try to keep it between 4 and 5 defenses, and those are the 4 that I'm going to be going with. So, a lot of information. Hope I haven't overwhelmed you. I want to thank you for joining me. I encourage you to use this sheet however you can. Screenshot it a couple of times. Use this information. Hopefully it's of some value to you. I encourage you to drop any opinions or comments below. I'll be back to my regular format this coming week where I break down each position by video. Please share this video, like it, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you get notified when my next video posts, which I will be posting a lineup building video and game by game game by game breakdown right after this video. Um, and I'll be back shortly to do that. You can also follow me on Twitter at winningabout. Don't forget injury reports tomorrow at 11:30. And then check if you got 4 o'clock games, check that injury report at 3 o'clock. Always check that, even if they don't have a questionable tag. You never know what happens again, the flu or pull something during warm-ups. Always check that. So I'll be back shortly. Thanks again for joining me and hanging in there. I know it's a lot of information. Hopefully, as I said, you'll get some value of it. So I'll see you real soon. Thanks again. My name is Ty Patton. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports.